penthouse suites, billion-dollar smiles, parties that stretched into morning and names that shimmered like royalty on the marquee. It's the story of a man who seemed untouchable, a symbol of hustle, brilliance, reinvention. Sean Combs. Puff Daddy. P. Diddy. Love. He didn't just make music. He made culture. He didn't just wear luxury, he defined it. But the higher you build, the harder it is to hide the cracks. And when the fall comes, if it comes, it's not a stumble. It's a collapse. Sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. This is the story of Diddy's empire, the mansions, the millions, and the massive fall that no one saw coming, or maybe no one wanted to see. Now, before we begin, let me ask something small of you. If you enjoy these quiet stories beneath the noise, if you find comfort in voices that dig beneath the glitter, then consider giving this video a like. Subscribe, so you'll always have a place to come back to, for the stories others are too loud to tell slowly. And please, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Are you winding down in your bed, headphones on? Sitting by a window, eyes half closed? I always wonder who's drifting into history with me, night after night. Strangers, yet connected by silence, by curiosity, by the comfort of a voice that won't rush the truth. Now then, settle in. The lights are low. The story begins. There are men who stumble into fame. And then, there are those who build it, brick by brick, flash by flash, with the precision of a sculptor and the hunger of a man who knows he was born to be seen. Sean Combs was the latter. Long before he was Puff Daddy, or Diddy, or Love. He was a boy from Harlem with something to prove. Not just to the world, but to himself. You see, Diddy didn't wait for someone to discover him. He designed himself like a skyscraper, calculated, reflective, impossible to ignore. Everything from the walk to the laugh, to the tailored suits and perfectly thrown parties. All of it was part of the myth he was constructing in real time. And make no mistake, it was a myth. But it was also a mirror. Because for every oversized fur coat and champagne bottle, for every diamond-studded watch and private jet tarmac photo, there was something deeper underneath. A boy whose father was murdered when he was 2. A young man raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. A teenager watching the gap between rich and poor from both sides of the Bronx River. So when he entered Howard University, not just as a student, but as a cultural force in waiting, he already had a vision. He interned at Uptown Records not because he loved filing papers, but because he understood proximity. Proximity to power, to artists, to the energy of change. He worked for free, but moved like a man on salary. And soon, people noticed. Andre Harrell gave him a shot. And from there, the legend began to crystallize. But Diddy wasn't just hustling behind the scenes. He was studying, meticulously, how image, sound, movement, and myth could intertwine. He watched how stars were built, how fame could be engineered. And then he did what very few ever have the courage, or audacity, to do. He made himself the product. Not just a producer. Not just a label exec. But a walking brand. A spectacle. A masterclass in calculated charisma. It's important to understand this. Diddy didn't just want to win. He wanted to dominate every room he entered. He didn't want to be a player in the game. He wanted to be the game. So he blurred the lines. Between street and boardroom. Between artist and mogul. Between man and myth. He called himself Puffy. Then Puff Daddy. Then P. Diddy. Then Diddy. then simply love. Each reinvention was less about confusion and more about control. He wasn't running from who he was. He was adding layers, creating a story so vast, so glittering, that the man beneath it could disappear when needed, or reemerge stronger than ever. You might call that marketing. I call it architecture. And no one in hip-hop built a monument to themselves quite like Sean Combs. But here's the thing about myths. They're dazzling. They're powerful. And they're often hiding something. Because when you spend your life building an empire made of light and illusion, you must pray no one ever flips the switch. And in time, someone did. But before the cracks began to show, before the lawsuits, the headlines, the federal raids, there was just a man in a mirror, designing himself into legend. And the world watched. And bought in. Because the myth was just that good. Before there were private jets. Before the champagne fountains and platinum records. Before the red carpets and the power lunches in Beverly Hills. There was Harlem. Not the Harlem of glossy nostalgia, but the Harlem of the 1970s. A neighborhood pulsing with rhythm, style, danger, and ambition. And that is where Sean Combs was born. November 4th, 1969. Just as the world was teetering on the edge of a new decade. Just as the Bronx, Harlem, and Queens were beginning to whisper the earliest beats of what would become hip-hop. But for young Sean, life was far from glamorous. He grew up in a housing project in Mount Vernon, just north of the city, a world that held equal measures of resilience and risk. The kind of place where dreams didn't bloom easily, but when they did, they burned bright. Because survival required imagination. Now, let's go back just a little further. To the man he never really got to know. Melvin Combs. Sean's father was a figure of myth in his own right. A Vietnam veteran, a street hustler, a man who moved in and out of dangerous circles with a quiet kind of command. Some say he was associated with notorious Harlem crime figures. Some say he was just trying to provide. But what's certain is this. When Sean was only 2 years old, Melvin Combs was murdered, shot in his car on Central Park West. He died alone, slumped behind the wheel of a Cadillac. And just like that, the most formative relationship in Sean's life became a ghost story. The death left a hole. Not just emotional, but spiritual. Because a father's absence doesn't echo in a single moment. It lingers. In questions. In fears. In the desperate desire to become something so large that the pain can't touch you anymore. Sean was raised by his mother, Janice. A woman of extraordinary strength. She worked as a model and a teacher's assistant. She did what black mothers have done for generations. She held the world together with threadbare hands and quiet fury. She raised him on discipline, on prayer, on drive. And she watched him move through the world like a storm no one could contain. As a kid, Sean wasn't just active. He was electric. He ran track, played football. He danced like no one was watching, and even when they were, he danced harder. There was a fire in him. A sense that time was running out, even when he was only 10 years old. They say he earned the nickname, Puffy, because of the way his chest puffed out when he got angry. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe he was puffed up with purpose. Even as a child, he understood what it meant to feel small. And he hated it. So he moved big. Talked big. Dreamed big. And by the time he graduated high school from Mount St. Michael Academy, a private Catholic school in the Bronx, he was already charting his path. He enrolled at Howard University in Washington, D.C., the legendary HBCU known not just for its academics, but for its cultural power. Howard was where black excellence was polished into something sharp. It wasn't enough to be talented there. You had to command attention. Sean didn't just attend Howard. He treated it like a proving ground. He threw parties that became legendary. He studied marketing like it was scripture. And more than anything, he watched. He watched who had power, how they moved, what they wore, who they needed, and who they feared. And then he made his move. While still a sophomore, he landed an unpaid internship at Uptown Records, a label that was redefining what R&B and hip-hop could be. And that's where the spark met the flame. At Uptown, Sean wasn't just filing records. He was whispering ideas in ears, putting together demos, organizing showcases, and studying the game from behind the curtain. He wasn't supposed to be producing anything, but he did. He wasn't supposed to be recruiting talent, but he did. And he wasn't supposed to stand out, but he did. Because he knew what Harlem had taught him. He knew what his father's death had taught him. That nobody hands you a seat at the table. You build your own. Or you flip theirs over. And so, from the ashes of trauma, from a home without a father, from a neighborhood that tried to crush him, Sean Combs built his foundation, brick by brick, beat by beat, Harlem to Howard, boy to brand. And that was only the beginning. Some men chase the dream. Others build the dream from nothing and dare the world to keep up. By the early 1990s, Sean Combs had already shown that he wasn't just another intern at Uptown Records. He was a force. A young man with too much vision, too many ideas, and, perhaps most dangerously, too much nerve. He wasn't content to simply climb the ranks. He wanted to reshape the system that handed out success in crumbs. To him, music wasn't just sound. It was architecture. It was identity. It was empire. And so, in 1993, after being abruptly fired from Uptown Records, yes, fired, despite his talent, Sean made the boldest move of his career. He started his own label. He called it Bad Boy Records. It sounded cocky, rebellious, dangerous. But underneath the swagger was a crystal clear strategy. Bad Boy wasn't just going to be a label. It was going to be a culture. Sean launched it with the help of Arista Records, under Clive Davis. A savvy move that gave him distribution power without sacrificing creative control. But the true engine of Bad Boy was the roster. You see, Sean had a gift, not just for beats, not just for marketing, but for spotting brilliance before it bloomed. And that gift led him to one name that would define the 90s. Christopher Wallace. A Brooklyn poet with a thunderous voice and a 1,000-yard stare. Better known to the world as the Notorious B.I.G. Or simply, Biggie. Biggie wasn't just talented. He was transformative. And under Sean's guidance, now going by Puff Daddy, Biggie's raw street storytelling met glossy, radio-friendly production. It was grimy and glamorous at the same time. Like silk over scars. Their collaboration gave birth to Biggie's debut album in 1994, Ready to Die, a record that didn't just top charts. It stopped time. The lyrics were heavy. The beats were cinematic. The persona? Unforgettable. And Puff was right beside him. Ad-libs, production, vision. He wasn't just a background figure. He was the man pulling the strings and shining the spotlight. From that moment on, Bad Boy became a machine. It wasn't just Biggie. Soon, the label was home to a constellation of rising stars. Faith Evans, with her gospel-rooted vocals and soul-drenched ballads. 112, with smooth harmonies that melted into R&B perfection. Maze, the laid-back MC with a velvet flow. Total, the female trio with attitude and elegance. And of course, Puff himself, who had no intention of staying behind the scenes. He started to release music under his own name, dancing in videos, suits, champagne, white parties. He was the executive, the performer, the brand, all in one. A walking contradiction, businessman and hype man. And it worked. Because no one else was doing what Puff was doing. He wasn't trying to imitate the West Coast. He was building an East Coast dynasty. Every beat felt like a celebration. Every video looked like a short film. Every artist was styled like royalty. And it wasn't accidental. Puff understood something that many didn't. Presentation was power. While Death Row Records out in LA embodied a darker, more confrontational tone. Bad Boy was champagne-soaked elegance. It was Harlem swag meets Madison Avenue polish. And by the mid-1990s, Bad Boy wasn't just a label. It was a movement. Commercials, remixes, magazine covers, fashion collaborations, even a sense of aspiration that extended beyond the music. People didn't just want to listen to Bad Boy. They wanted to live it. But what made Bad Boy revolutionary wasn't just the hits. It was how Puff blurred the lines between artist and mogul. He saw no boundaries. He could throw a party with Naomi Campbell on Tuesday, cut a track with Biggie on Wednesday, and ink a clothing deal by Friday. And then do it all again the next week, only bigger. The music itself began to reflect that fusion. Biggie rapping over the Isley Brothers, Faith covering Rolls Royce, Maze sliding over Diana Ross samples. Hip-hop became glossy without losing its teeth, radio-friendly without selling out. And the public? They couldn't get enough. Bad Boy was everywhere. Late-night talk shows, award shows, MTV, TRL. Puff Daddy became a household name, and with that came the emergence of the shiny suit era. Remember that? Sequins, leather, lasers. It was theatrical, outrageous, and absolutely unforgettable. But beneath the glitter, Puff was making serious moves. He was branding himself, trademarking the Bad Boy logo, launching clothing lines like Sean John, diversifying the empire while keeping his hand on the music. And it all traced back to that moment. In 1993, when a 23-year-old with something to prove decided to bet on himself. Bad Boy was born out of a rejection, out of a firing, out of a world that didn't believe he could run the show. But Puff didn't just run it. He rewrote it. Every empire has its king. And for Bad Boy Records, that king was Christopher Wallace. The world would come to know him by many names. Biggie Smalls, the Notorious B.I.G. But to Sean Combs, he was simply Big. A once-in-a-generation voice. A poetic thunderstorm in Timberlands. Their meeting wasn't just a business transaction. It was destiny, messy, complicated, brilliant destiny. Let's go back. In the early 90s, hip-hop was still trying to define itself. It was growing beyond block parties and boomboxes. It had entered the charts, the boardrooms, the suburbs. But it hadn't yet found its full emotional range. It hadn't yet told the whole story, not like Biggie could. Big was a product of Brooklyn's Clinton Hill, raised by a single mother, a schoolteacher from Jamaica. He was smart, honor roll smart. And yet, like so many kids of his generation, the weight of his environment pulled him into the streets. Drugs, danger, dreams. He didn't rap to escape. He rapped to document. His bars weren't fantasies. They were confessions, full of contradiction. A man who loved his mama, but sold crack. who laughed with friends but slept with fear, who dreamed of heaven but woke up in hell. Sean Combs found Biggie through a demo tape, raw and haunting. It wasn't just the flow. It was the way Big painted pictures with syllables. You didn't just hear his lyrics. You saw the hallway light flicker. You felt the cold of the metal bench. You smelled the cheap cologne and cigarette smoke. Puff signed him almost immediately. He didn't see just a rapper. He saw a storyteller with mass appeal. And Big, for all his street edge, trusted Puff's vision. Together, they began crafting Ready to Die, Biggie's debut album. Puff added cinematic flair, sample-heavy beats, and a kind of emotional scaffolding to Big's grit. He didn't sanitize Biggie, he amplified him. Released in September 1994, Ready to Die wasn't just an album. It was a declaration of East Coast revival, of emotional vulnerability, of street life with Shakespearean gravity. Tracks like Juicy Big Papa and Warning didn't just chart. They changed the tone of rap. In Juicy, Biggie laid out his life story, from sardines for dinner to champagne celebrations. It was aspirational without being fake. He never forgot where he came from. He just wanted better. Big Papa made him a sex symbol, despite what the beauty standards said. His confidence was magnetic. His voice hypnotic. And suicidal thoughts? That was the side of fame no one talked about. Depression. Isolation. Fear. It was raw and jarring, and so very human. Biggie wasn't performing. He was bleeding onto the mic. And Puff, for all his flashy suits and loud presence, was quietly sculpting this into something that transcended genres. He made sure the videos looked like mini-films. He ensured the hooks stuck in your head. He dressed big in Cookie sweaters and Versace shades and made Brooklyn synonymous with style. Together, they didn't just rule the charts. They redefined the East Coast sound. They gave it polish without losing pain. And it worked. Ready to Die went platinum. Then multi-platinum. Biggie became the face of New York hip-hop. But more importantly, he became the voice of honesty in rap. And the world noticed. Suddenly, Bad Boy wasn't just a label. It was the label. The one with the notorious B.I.G. The one with Puff, dancing in shiny suits, with a cigar in one hand and a platinum plaque in the other. For a brief, golden moment, it was all working. Biggie was a star. Puff was a mogul. And Bad Boy was on top of the world. But empires, no matter how glittering, are fragile things. And behind the scenes, fame was doing what it always does. Isolating. Exposing. Feeding the flames of rivalries that would burn far too hot. Still, in this moment, before the storm, Biggie and Puff created something eternal. A sound. A feeling. A golden age. One born not just from ambition, but from a deep, uncanny trust between two very different men. One from Harlem, one from Brooklyn, bound by the beat, and united by the dream of something bigger. Fame is a fire. Some people are warmed by it. Others are consumed. And Sean Combs, the boy from Harlem with ambition stitched into every cell, didn't just step into that fire. He danced in it. Champagne in one hand, platinum plaque in the other, and the world couldn't look away. By the mid-1990s, Puff Daddy wasn't just a name. He was an institution, a brand, a movement, a walking spectacle. He had swagger before the word was popularized, a kind of kinetic charm that pulled cameras toward him like gravity. You have to understand something. Diddy wasn't merely successful, he made success theatrical. While other execs stayed in the shadows, Puff threw himself onto stages. He didn't just produce albums. He starred in the music videos. He danced in the back of Biggie's "Mo Money, Mo Problems," suited in metallic red, floating downstairs like a deity of excess. He wasn't just making stars. He was one. Bad Boy Records became the soundtrack of the era. Biggie, Faith Evans, Maze, 112, total, hit after hit after hit. And Diddy, like a maestro in a velvet suit, orchestrated it all with champagne flair and a diamond-crusted baton. And with every hit, his legend grew louder. Every party was louder. Every yacht was bigger. Every tabloid headline more unbelievable. He bought mansions that looked like modern palaces. Hosted parties with waterfalls flowing into pools shaped like his initials. He bathed in crystal, wore mink coats to summer events, and flew in private jets just to get a slice of his favorite cheesecake. His fashion sense? Loud, daring, unapologetic. White suits on red carpets, alligator loafers, diamond-studded watches that told more than time, they told status. In the club, Diddy didn't just pop bottles, he redefined the entire ritual of celebration. It was Diddy who turned bottle service into a luxury art form. Diddy who coined Ciroc Boys, long before brand ambassadorships became an industry. Diddy who made the velvet rope feel like a throne room. He was, in every sense, a king of the moment. But here's the twist. For all the spectacle, it wasn't hollow. Diddy wasn't just showing off for the cameras. He was crafting mythology. He understood branding before the term left marketing textbooks. He made sure people saw him in the studio, and on the yacht, in the boardroom, and in the club. Because for Diddy, image and empire were inseparable. He turned himself into a lifestyle, aspirational, untouchable, magnetic. A symbol for every kid from the block who had ever dared to dream of marble floors and Maybachs. And for a time, it seemed like nothing could slow him down. Every event he touched turned gold. He launched clothing lines like Sean John, bringing streetwear to the runways of Paris and Milan. He walked alongside fashion legends and sat front row with royalty. He entered the liquor business, the fragrance industry, the film world. Diddy wasn't satisfied with a seat at the table. He built his own table, carved in mahogany and rimmed with spotlight bulbs. And then, he made the whole world watch. But with all that light, came shadows. There were whispers of tension behind the scenes, of deals that were flash without structure, of artists who shined, then vanished, of money that moved fast, maybe too fast. And the question began to form quietly. How long can a man run this hot, without burning out? Still, in the glare of the limelight, Diddy was untouchable. He danced through scandals. He smirked through lawsuits. He partied through pressure. Because for Puff, the show never stopped. The brand had to shine. The empire had to grow. And he had to remain the king. Fame. Flash. Excess. In the 1990s and early 2000s, no one embodied the fantasy more completely than Sean, Puff Daddy, Combs. And millions cheered him on, not just because he had made it, but because, in some way, he made them feel like they could too. But fame always has a price. And for Diddy, the bill was coming. If you listen closely during the noise of the late 90s, beyond the platinum records and the bass thumping clubs, you could hear something else rising from within Sean Combs. Something quieter, calculated. A mind not just for music, but for empire. Because while most were busy watching Puff Daddy the performer, Diddy the showman, behind the curtain, another figure was taking shape. one far more enduring. Sean Combs, the businessman. You see, fame is fleeting. Charts change. Tastes shift. The limelight moves. But ownership? Legacy? That's the true endgame. And Diddy understood that, earlier and more sharply than almost anyone else in the hip-hop world. Let's start with Sean John. In 1998, at the height of his musical success, Combs launched his own clothing line, not just as a celebrity endorsement, but as a full-fledged fashion brand. He didn't want to be the face. He wanted to be the founder. Sean John wasn't novelty merch. It was premium streetwear with tailored edges. Clean lines, urban silhouettes, and an aspirational price tag. It fused Harlem swagger with Fifth Avenue polish. And it worked. By the early 2000s, Sean John was everywhere, worn by artists, athletes, executives. It was one of the first hip-hop-led fashion houses to truly cross over into mainstream respectability. It earned Diddy a CFDA Menswear Designer of the Year award in 2004, putting him alongside legends of fashion. Not as a mascot, but as a mogul. But clothes were just the beginning. Because Sean Combs wasn't content building a brand, he wanted a portfolio. Next came Ciroc. Now, Ciroc was already a product, a little-known French vodka, nearly forgotten on the shelves. But Diddy didn't just slap his name on it. He reinvented it. He turned Ciroc into a lifestyle, into celebration, into aspiration. In 2007, he struck a groundbreaking deal, a 50-50 profit-sharing partnership with DIDDY'S, the spirits conglomerate behind Ciroc. It was unheard of at the time. Not a paycheck. Not a sponsorship. An equity stake. That changed everything. Diddy didn't sell vodka. He sold status. He positioned Ciroc as the toast of the elite, the drink of choice for parties in South Beach, penthouses in Manhattan, and VIP booths around the world. Under his influence, sales skyrocketed from 40,000 cases a year to over 2 million. And with that move, Diddy did something few in hip-hop had done before. He flipped the script from artist to investor, from entertainer to architect. And then, there was revolt. In 2013, while traditional media struggled to adapt to the digital age, Sean Combs announced the launch of his own music television network. Yes, his own network. Revolt was ambitious. It aimed to do for the 2010s what MTV had done in the 80s and BT in the 90s, but this time, on Diddy's terms. Music, culture, social justice, emerging voices. He envisioned it as a platform that would not only showcase music videos, but shape conversation. It wasn't just about visibility, it was about power. Because what Diddy had come to realize was this. True power didn't lie in fame. It lay in infrastructure, in distribution, in platforms, in ownership. From clothes to vodka to television to tech startups. Sean Combs was becoming something far rarer than a pop star. He was becoming a brand ecosystem. By 2019, Forbes estimated his net worth at $740 million, much of it tied not to his record sales, but to his business ventures. He was now rubbing shoulders not just with music icons, but with billionaires and boardrooms. And yet, the image never changed. He was still the life of the party. Still dancing in all-white suits. Still showing up with a grin and a bottle of Ciroc. But now, he owned the party. The venue. The media coverage. And probably the liquor license, too. It's a strange, powerful thing, to be both a symbol and a strategist. To sell the dream, while quietly holding the deed. And Sean Combs did it masterfully. He didn't just build a brand. He built a blueprint. for artists, for entrepreneurs, for an entire generation of young black creatives who saw in him not just success, but sovereignty. But as with all empires, there's always a cost. And behind the polished boardrooms and towering mansions, shadows were gathering. Because as much as Diddy had rewritten the playbook on wealth and image, the cracks, once invisible, would begin to show. And soon the music would turn into questions. There's a certain kind of legend that forms, not around what a man does, but around what seems to happen when he walks into a room. Sean Combs, Puff Daddy P. Diddy by the early 2000s was no longer simply a man in hip-hop. He was a myth. A modern-day King Midas, in tailored suits and designer sunglasses. A figure who seemed to turn every idea, every venture, every whisper of a deal, into gold. It wasn't just success. It was patterned success. Too consistent to be coincidence. Too bold to be luck. His nickname wasn't just clever branding. It was prophecy. And the world noticed. You could feel it in the way his name was spoken in boardrooms, not with skepticism, but with a kind of awe. The man who took a flailing vodka brand and turned it into a cultural symbol. The mogul who wore silk shirts while controlling equity tables. The artist who used music as his first chess move, not his only one. Let's be clear, this wasn't just a matter of wealth. Plenty of artists made money. But Diddy had something else, an aura, a mystique. People believed in his touch. That undefinable quality that made brands sell, ideas spread, and rooms light up. If he walked into a club, the club became the hottest in town. If he endorsed a product, sales doubled. If he posted about an event, it was sold out before the second click. And it wasn't just fans. Corporations chased him. Institutions studied him. Harvard Business Review analyzed his brand strategy. Time magazine listed him among the 100 most influential people. Forbes watched him rise the ranks of the highest paid entertainers year after year. To the outside world, Diddy was untouchable. Bad Boy Records? A cultural cornerstone. Sean John? Sold in Macy's and worn by NBA stars. Ciroc? A top-shelf name, synonymous with prestige. Revolt? A media platform that dared to speak in real time, in real voices. Every move seemed deliberate. Timed. He didn't follow trends. He made them. From oversized jackets and shiny suits to minimalist elegance and monochrome palettes, Diddy set the tone, not only for fashion, but for ambition itself. Even his parties became part of the legend. The infamous White Party, a now mythical gathering of celebrities, moguls, royalty, and models, all dressed head to toe in white, was more than a social event. It was a signal, a cultural beacon. If you were there, you had arrived. If you weren't, you were watching. And behind all of it, there was a constant hum. How does he do it? Some chalked it up to instinct, an unteachable feel for culture, timing, and people. Others said it was strategy, cold calculation under all that charisma. But many simply believed it was magic. Because somehow, no matter what he touched, music, liquor, clothes, cable networks, the result was the same. Millions. Sometimes hundreds of millions. And that mythology, that sense of inevitability, became his greatest asset. People bought into Diddy not just because of what he sold, but because of who they believed he was. A rainmaker. A winner. A modern-day alchemist. In business, perception is power. And Diddy mastered both. When others launched brands, he launched movements. When others promoted products, he sculpted lifestyles. And when others diversified, he dominated. But here's the thing about the Midas touch. In the old myth, the golden gift is a curse. Everything the king touched turned to gold, even the things he loved. Even the people. And while Diddy's empire continued to shine outwardly, from Wall Street admiration to Hollywood red carpets, something darker was beginning to churn just beneath the surface. Power of that magnitude draws shadows. And soon, the very aura that lifted him would begin to obscure him, casting doubt, speculation, and whispers into what had once been applause. Because the higher you rise, the more the world begins to look closer. There's a moment, if you close your eyes, you can see it. A man in a reflective silver suit, moving like liquid confidence under strobe lights, flanked by dancers and bathed in glittering opulence. The sound of a hypnotic beat, sampled from an 80s classic, pulses behind him. He's rapping, smiling, pointing at the camera like he already knows he owns the future. This was the shiny suit era. It wasn't just a chapter in Diddy's career, it was a statement. A shimmering declaration that style could be louder than sound, that spectacle could become substance, and that hip-hop itself was no longer confined to street corners or smoky studios. It had arrived at the penthouse, and Diddy held the keys. The late 1990s were already strange and transitional. Hip-hop was growing up, crossing over, learning to wear suits without losing its soul. And there, at the center of that transformation, was Sean Combs, dressed head to toe in metallic fabric, rhinestones, silk, and swagger. Some mocked it. Some loved it. But no one could ignore it. The shiny suit became a metaphor for the Diddy aesthetic, bold, polished, unapologetically excessive. Every music video was a mini-movie. Helicopters, yachts, diamond-encrusted everything. He was often shirtless, oiled, and dancing like James Brown reimagined for the MTV generation. This wasn't rap for the underground. This was rap for the billboards. For Madison Avenue. For America. And it worked. Brilliantly. Music videos like M.O. Money, M.O. Problems, with Diddy, Maze, and posthumously featured Biggie, weren't just hits, they were cultural shifts. They merged rap with luxury, hip-hop with haute couture. Suddenly, brands were paying attention. Fashion designers were sending him samples. High society was inviting him to the same tables they once locked shut. But here's the twist. Behind the flash was strategy. Diddy understood, better than almost anyone in the game, that image was currency. That every frame, every outfit, every music video still was a piece of the myth he was building, a visual language that screamed power, wealth, and modern royalty. The shiny suits weren't just shiny. They were armor. Against irrelevance. Against imitation. Against time. He was reinventing himself in real time, not just as a rapper or producer, but as a cultural architect. Each album, each collaboration, each headline was a chess move in the grand game of reinvention. 1 minute, he was remixing Notorious B.I.G. into anthem-like tributes. The next, he was walking fashion runways or launching new vodka lines. And while others chased trends, Diddy manufactured them. Think about it. Before Kanye had Yeezy, Diddy had Sean John. Before Drake had his private jet, Diddy had a fleet. Before social media made flexing normal, Diddy made it aspirational. The shiny suit may have faded as a literal garment, but its spirit endured. Diddy evolved with every season. When the world wanted ghetto fabulous, he delivered gold-plated elegance. When fashion turned minimalist, he wore black turtlenecks and tailored jackets. When hip-hop went introspective, he appeared with somber tracks and heartfelt verses. He moved like water, flowing into whatever shape culture required, without ever losing the core of his brand, unapologetic ambition. And this is why Diddy's career never stalled. Because he never stopped changing. He blurred the lines between artist and mogul, rapper and CEO, celebrity and philosopher. He would say things like, "Don't chase the paper, chase the dream." And people believed him. Because he didn't just say it. He wore it. He danced it. He lived it. And so, when people speak of the shiny suit era, they sometimes reduce it to glitter and vanity. But they miss the deeper truth. It was an era of rebranding, of economic warfare by way of charisma, of a black man in America using fashion, music, and media to become untouchable. Not just in charts, but in perception. Diddy didn't just wear shiny suits. He reflected the world back to itself, shinier, louder, and more powerful than anyone thought possible. And as the spotlight intensified, so did the shadows. Because beneath every reinvention, something old must be buried. There are moments in a man's life that split time in half, before and after. For Sean Diddy Combs, March 9, 1997, was that line. Before that night, there was brilliance. There was bravado. There was laughter in the studio and champagne in the green rooms, platinum records and red carpets. After that night, there was silence. There was blood on the pavement. There were unanswered questions that still hum like static behind every beat Diddy ever produced after. Because that was the night Christopher Wallace, better known to the world as the notorious B.I.G., was murdered. Biggie wasn't just Diddy's star. He was his brother in sound, his business partner, his muse, his friend. And he was gone in seconds. Underscore 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 underscore. It happened in Los Angeles, after a party hosted by Vibe magazine and Quest Records at the Peterson Automotive Museum. Biggie had been in high spirits. He had told interviewers that he was excited about life again. About new projects, a new album, and putting the chaos of the East Coast/West Coast feud behind him. But fate had already made its decision. Just after midnight, Biggie was riding in the front passenger seat of a GMC Suburban. Diddy was in a car ahead, part of a multi-vehicle caravan leaving the event. They were at a red light on Wilshire Boulevard when a black Chevy Impala pulled up beside them. A lone gunman rolled down his window and fired 4 shots. All of them struck Biggie. One fatally. He was pronounced dead just after 1 a.m. He was only 24 years old. To understand what this did to Diddy, we have to first understand what Biggie meant to him. Diddy had discovered Christopher Wallace in the early 90s, a towering young MC from Brooklyn who could paint entire novels with just a few bars. The moment he heard him rap, Diddy knew this was it. Biggie was raw talent, and Diddy had the vision to shape it into a cultural earthquake. Together, they built Bad Boy Records into a dynasty. They were not just collaborators. They were architects of a new sound, a new era. The music was gritty and luxurious, street and polished, pain and poetry. Biggie's debut, Ready to Die, was a critical and commercial success, and it cemented both their legacies overnight. But success came with shadows. By the mid-1990s, the infamous East Coast/West Coast rivalry had grown into something volatile and violent. What began as a competitive tension between two regions of hip-hop soon turned into a dangerous mythology, fueled by record labels, fans, and yes, sometimes the artists themselves. At the center stood two icons, Biggie on the East Coast, and Tupac Shakur on the West. And though neither Diddy nor Biggie ever publicly endorsed violence, they were swept into the narrative. Accusations, diss tracks, tabloid speculation. The 1994 shooting of Tupac in New York, which Tupac later insinuated Biggie and Diddy had knowledge of, only deepened the divide. In September 1996, Tupac was gunned down in Las Vegas. Just 6 months later, Biggie was murdered in LA. And the world of hip-hop was never the same. Diddy was in the city when Biggie died. He was part of the entourage. He saw the chaos. He heard the shots. He followed the ambulance. And then, he wept. In interviews, he's admitted to a kind of emotional paralysis after the murder. The man who had been everywhere, loud, shining, magnetic, went quiet. Friends said he barely spoke for days. He felt responsible. Not because he pulled the trigger, of course, but because he had brought Biggie into this world of celebrity, of danger, of coastal wars. Because he had built a kingdom with his friend, and then watched that friend die on his watch. Professionally, Diddy did what he always did. He turned grief into motion. Just months after the murder, he released the single, "I'll Be Missing You," a tribute to Biggie that featured Faith Evans and 112. The song was mournful, raw, beautiful, and it became a global anthem for loss. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 11 weeks. But behind the scenes, the success was bittersweet. Diddy was haunted. Interviews from the time reveal a man both heartbroken and conflicted, unsure whether to mourn in silence or mourn through music. Whether the success of the tribute honored Biggie or cheapened his legacy. He was angry. He was scared. He was exhausted. But he kept building. Privately, those close to Diddy say this was when the paranoia set in. Security doubled. Friends were vetted. Trust became currency, and very few had it. He feared for his own life. He questioned his circle. He moved like a man who had seen too much too soon. And who can blame him? Two young black men, the two faces of hip-hop, had been murdered in public, within 6 months of each other. No arrests. No trials. Just body bags and conspiracy theories. Diddy would go on to build an empire. Sean John. Ciroc. Revolt. Countless hits and awards. But the loss of Biggie remained a scar beneath the silk. He once said, "That's when I knew nothing was promised. Not tomorrow. Not success. Not even your best friend." And maybe that's the lesson of this chapter. That even kings bleed. That fame does not shield you from fate. And that the cost of building an empire is sometimes everything you love. There was a time, brief but electric, when the world watched Sean Combs and Jennifer Lopez walk into a room and held its breath. He was hip-hop royalty, brash, brilliant, dressed in tailored suits and dripping with confidence. She was the Bronx-born dancer turned global starlet, radiant, ambitious, and on the cusp of superstardom. Together, they weren't just a couple. They were an image, a mood, a brand in motion. It was 1999, and nothing in pop culture shimmered quite like Puff Daddy and J. Lo. But like many things in Diddy's orbit, beneath the glitter, there was chaos. And in the end, it wasn't love that broke them, it was gunfire, scandal, and the sobering weight of reputation. Let's unravel it. They met during the production of Jennifer Lopez's debut album, On the 6th, in 1998. Diddy, already a musical powerhouse, took an interest in her both professionally and personally. At the time, J. Lo was transitioning from actress to pop singer, and Diddy was an ideal guide through the maze of the music industry. Their chemistry was instant. Fiery. Public. They became inseparable. Red carpets, private jets, paparazzi flashes. He brought her into hip-hop's inner sanctum. She pulled him into the Hollywood spotlight. Together, they redefined the idea of a power couple for a new generation. Not movie stars, not political dynasties, but two kids from New York who made themselves into empires. Everywhere they went, the cameras followed. And for a while, they didn't mind. Until it all went too far. December 27, 1999. Club New York. Manhattan. Diddy and Jennifer arrived late, as was the norm. They were joined by an entourage, celebrating in a velvet-robed VIP section. The club pulsed with the usual energy of the holidays, champagne flowing, whispers thick in the air. But something went wrong. Witnesses claimed Diddy got into an altercation with another man. A disrespect, a drink spilled, perhaps something worse. No one can agree on what started it. But what happened next is well documented. Gunshots. 3 of them. Panic. Screaming. Bodies ducking behind furniture. Glass shattering. Security scrambling. When the smoke cleared, 3 people were injured. Not killed, but wounded enough to send shockwaves through the city. And Diddy? He was gone. He fled the club with Jennifer in tow, speeding away in a Lincoln Navigator, eventually pulled over by the NYPD. In the SUV, police found a stolen 9mm handgun, and suddenly, this wasn't just a nightclub story. It was national news. Diddy was arrested. So was J. Lo. Mugshots. Flashbulbs. The internet, still young then, exploded. For Jennifer Lopez, this moment threatened everything. She had spent years shedding the perception of being just another Latina actress, building a carefully controlled, upward trajectory brand. A felony charge could have unraveled all of it. Her face on the front page of tabloids was not part of the plan. She was released without charge. The gun wasn't hers. The witnesses had nothing on her. But Diddy's case dragged on. For 2 years he fought the charge. Illegal weapons possession. Bribery allegations. Witness tampering. The media salivated. He was already no stranger to controversy. But this was different. This was criminal court. And through it all, Jennifer stood by him. Quietly. Carefully. But inevitably, the weight became too much. They broke up in 2001, just before the trial ended. In public, there was no spectacle. No dramatic statement. No fireworks. But privately, it was a shift. Jennifer moved on, quickly and with precision. She realigned her image, focusing on acting, music, and eventually, the carefully curated reinvention we know today. Jenny from the block would become a brand, not a memory. Her time with Diddy, while pivotal, was now behind glass. As for Diddy, he was acquitted on all charges in 2001. The courtroom erupted in relief. He walked free, clean in the eyes of the law, but stained, in some ways, by public perception. Because the glitz had curdled. The champagne bubbles had popped. And the world had seen something rawer, more dangerous beneath the polished exterior. That's the thing about power couples. When they fall, they don't just trip. They crash. And this crash reshaped both of them. In later years, both would speak kindly of the relationship. No bitterness. No regrets. Diddy has even said that losing Jennifer was one of the hardest things he ever endured. And perhaps it was. Because for a man who built his empire on image and myth, losing that image, of love, of partnership, of balance, was a kind of heartbreak that no platinum record could repair. They were fire. They were flash. But fire, if not contained, always consumes. There's a moment, somewhere in every empire, when the illusion of control begins to crack. For Sean Diddy Combs, that moment arrived in the winter of 1999, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Manhattan police precinct, with the world watching. Now, we've already revisited the chaos of that night, the nightclub shooting, the frantic getaway, the discovery of a gun in the SUV. But the aftermath, the long legal battle, and the curious way it ended, that deserves its own chapter. Because not everyone walked away from that night untouched. And not everyone walked away at all. Let's start with the names. There was Diddy, of course, the mogul, the face of Bad Boy Records, the man with everything to lose. There was Jennifer Lopez, arrested briefly, but ultimately cleared, her public image taking a hit it would take years to fully polish away. And then, there was Jamal Barrow. The world would come to know him by another name, Shine. He was a rising star in the bad boy camp. A young rapper from Brooklyn with a gravel-lined voice that reminded many of Biggie. Diddy had signed him in 1998, hoping to recreate some of that old magic. But in the chaos of Club New York, Shine's life took a sharp turn. He was the one who pulled the trigger. 3 people were injured. The charges were serious: attempted murder, assault, reckless endangerment, and criminal possession of a weapon. In the weeks that followed, the media spectacle only grew. Diddy turned to the best legal defense money could buy. His lead attorney was Benjamin Brafman, a sharp, media-savvy litigator with a flair for theatrics. Brafman's job was clear: protect the brand, protect the man. And he did. Masterfully. Throughout the trial, Brafman painted Diddy as a passive figure, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of circumstance, not a perpetrator. They argued that Diddy had no gun, that he hadn't told anyone to shoot, that he'd done nothing illegal. But Shine? He didn't have a legal team with the same firepower. And worse, he refused to flip. Despite suggestions that he could reduce his sentence by implicating Diddy, Shine held his tongue. He took the heat. Some say out of loyalty. Others say because he knew the rules of the street: you don't snitch. Regardless, when the verdicts came down in March 2001, the contrast was stark. Diddy acquitted on all charges. Free to go. Smiling, hugging his mother in court. Back to the limos, the cameras, the next business deal. Shine, guilty. Sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was a defining moment. Not just legally, but morally, culturally, spiritually. For many in the hip-hop community, it confirmed a long-held suspicion: the industry is not loyal. It is not fair. And when it comes down to it, the rich protect the rich. Shine had taken the fall. Diddy had taken the stage. The press, of course, had a field day. Headlines blared. Diddy walks, protege falls. Bad boy beats the rap. Shine's silence buys freedom, but not for himself. Even the courtroom dynamics became part of the legend. Shine sat silently, barely looking at his former mentor. Diddy, when asked if he'd support him, gave diplomatic answers. Money was reportedly offered behind the scenes, but the relationship fractured. Later, in prison interviews, Shine would speak cryptically, not openly bitter, but clearly wounded. He felt betrayed, forgotten. Years later, he would convert to Judaism, leave the rap game, and, incredibly, enter Belizean politics. But that's another story. Back in the US, the trial had other consequences. Diddy's brand took a hit, no question. His relationship with Jennifer Lopez ended shortly after. He changed his name from Puff Daddy to simply P. Diddy, a symbolic move, maybe, to shake off the controversy and reinvent himself. But the damage lingered. The shiny suit era, that glossy, champagne-drenched chapter of the late 90s, was suddenly over. In its place came questions. Was Diddy untouchable? Had he allowed a young artist to take the fall for his recklessness? Did justice serve its purpose, or protect its most profitable subject? In hindsight, the shooting marked a shift. Not just in Diddy's career, but in the cultural temperature around him. He was no longer just the king of hip-hop parties. He had seen the inside of a courtroom. He had watched a young man go to prison. He had narrowly avoided becoming another cautionary tale. And from that moment forward, you could sense it. Diddy got quieter. Not in sound or style. He was still extravagant, still headline-worthy. But in caution. In calculation. In the knowledge that even empires can fall. Especially when the spotlight turns into a searchlight. There's a peculiar rhythm to American fame, a cycle of rise, fall, and reinvention. And if you study the great figures of pop culture long enough, you begin to notice a pattern. The ones who survive, truly survive, don't just weather the storm, they learn to dance in the rain. Sean Combs, known at different points as Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or simply Love, was no stranger to storms. But what separated him from so many who crashed and burned was his relentless instinct for reinvention. After the 1999 nightclub shooting, after Shine went to prison, after his public image was tarnished and his relationship with Jennifer Lopez dissolved under the heat of scandal, Diddy stood at a precipice. He could have faded. Many thought he would. But instead, he pivoted. And what followed was one of the most remarkable image resurrections in modern entertainment. First, he got lean. Literally and figuratively. The flashy suits dulled. The parades of Cristal slowed. The hyper-commercial shine of the late 90s gave way to something more intentional. He was still a mogul, don't get me wrong, but now, his moves felt more precise. He became more of a curator than a showman. Behind the scenes, he tightened his brand, trimmed the entourage, and surrounded himself with strategists instead of hype men. His music reflected this evolution too. In 2001, he released The Saga Continues, a bad boy compilation album. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it was solid, a reminder that he still had his hands on the pulse. He leaned more heavily into production and business than frontline performance. He understood the game was changing, and so, he changed with it. Then came a masterstroke, redefining luxury in black culture. In 2003, Diddy launched Sean John's fragrance line, Unforgivable, and soon, it dominated department stores. His fashion label, Sean John, already a hit in urban markets, crossed over to high-end spaces. In 2004, he won Council of Fashion Designers of America's Menswear Designer of the Year, an honor few in hip-hop had ever dreamed of, let alone claimed. And perhaps most notably, he positioned himself as a man of refined taste. No longer just the wild party guy, he became the embodiment of aspirational success. He became the blueprint. And then came Ciroc. Ah yes. The vodka deal that didn't just add to his portfolio, it transformed it. In 2007, Diddy entered into a strategic partnership with the DIDDY'S vodka brand Ciroc. It was unconventional. He didn't simply endorse it, he agreed to help build it from the ground up in the US market. In return, he would receive a 50% share of the profits. At the time, Ciroc wasn't even in the top 50 vodka brands. But within a few years, thanks to Diddy's genius marketing, it exploded. He made it the drink of exclusivity, of velvet ropes and penthouses, of black excellence. And with every sip poured at clubs and private events, he wasn't just selling vodka, he was selling a lifestyle. Ciroc became synonymous with Diddy. And Diddy became something rarer than just an artist or businessman. He became a tastemaker. He also began to embrace a new role, cultural elder. He mentored younger artists, backed projects like Making the Band, which showcased his demanding, often brutal expectations for success, and yet people watched, admired it, learned from it. He hosted white parties in the Hamptons that became legends. He invested in television networks, fashion houses, beverage empires, even a charter school in Harlem. Diddy's comeback wasn't flashy. It was quietly dominant. But perhaps what truly solidified the comeback was how he handled the shadows. He didn't run from the ghosts of his past, not exactly. But he didn't dwell on them either. When asked about Shine, he spoke in respectful, measured tones. When Biggie's name came up, he honored the legacy. When critics poked at his history of controversies, lawsuits, and opulence, he simply kept building. Forward. Always forward. In time, people stopped associating Diddy with scandal. They associated him with wealth, with control, with power. He had transcended the title of rapper or producer. He was no longer just a man in the room. He owned the building. By the mid-2010s, Forbes regularly named him the highest-paid person in hip-hop. His net worth soared beyond $800 million. But perhaps most impressively, he made it all look inevitable. Like this was always where he was headed. Because he understood something very few people do. That in a world obsessed with noise and headlines, real power is quiet. It moves slowly. And when it returns, it doesn't ask permission. It simply walks back in, wearing a tailored suit, pouring a glass of Ciroc, and reminding everyone, the game never changed me. I changed the game. You see, power, real power, isn't just about money. It's about visibility. The ability to shape what millions see, hear, and think. To not just create culture, but to broadcast it. And in the early 2000s, Diddy, ever the shapeshifter, saw something coming that most in his world didn't take seriously yet. Reality television. To the average rapper or record executive back then, reality TV was a lowbrow circus, something for washed-up celebrities or tabloid regulars. But Diddy? Diddy saw the future. He didn't just walk through the door. He kicked it open. When Diddy joined the second season of the MTV reality series in 2002, it was no longer just a talent competition. It became a boot camp, a proving ground, a masterclass in ambition, pressure, and pain. The premise was simple on the surface: find the next big music group. But what made it electric was him. Because Diddy wasn't playing a role. He was the role. He strutted into that studio in crisp white shirts and designer coats, sunglasses on indoors, and a voice that cut like a blade. And then he did what he does best. He tested people. He tested their talent, their loyalty, their work ethic. He made them walk to Brooklyn for cheesecake, a task that became so infamous it's now a meme etched into hip-hop history. He scrutinized harmonies like a composer, berated laziness like a drill sergeant, and praised brilliance like a proud but unrelenting father. But beneath the bravado, there was a method to the madness. Diddy wasn't just teaching these young hopefuls how to sing. He was teaching them what the industry would demand of them. The sleepless nights. The constant criticism. The pressure to deliver at 3 a.m. when your voice is hoarse and your body wants to quit. And most of all, the willingness to be molded. Because in Diddy's world, raw talent was nothing without discipline. And he was the fire that shaped the steel. The results? They were real. He formed groups like the band, Down Eddie Kane, and later Day 26, acts that topped charts, sold records, and packed arenas, even if they later fell to the same internal conflicts and egos the show made famous. But the true genius wasn't just in the music. It was in the television. Diddy had turned artist development, once a hidden, internal process, into primetime entertainment. Millions tuned in each week, not just to hear music, but to watch dreams get built and broken under fluorescent lights and camera lenses. They watched as contestants cried, cracked, triumphed, and fell apart. They watched Diddy, equal parts mentor and tyrant, sculpting stars with the same intensity he once reserved for platinum albums. He didn't just command the room. He was the room. And MTV loved it. So did audiences. For years, making the band dominated ratings. And in doing so, Diddy secured something rarer than another #1 hit. He became a household name. Not just in music circles, but in suburban living rooms, college dorms, and middle American kitchens. The mogul in the mirrored shades became the face of drive, of hustle, of making it. And unlike scripted television, this was real, unfiltered, raw, human. People didn't just watch Diddy. They studied him. They copied his phrases, debated his decisions, and, even when they hated him, they kept coming back. Because underneath the ego and extravagance, there was a strange, magnetic honesty. He was showing you what it took to win. And it wasn't pretty. But let's not forget what this meant behind the scenes. While most artists stayed in their lanes, music, maybe fashion, Diddy was diversifying the empire. Every episode promoted his artists, his label, his brand. His studios got exposure. His music catalog got streamed. His Ciroc bottles showed up on camera. It was all connected. He wasn't just making bands. He was making markets. And as the reality boom exploded across the 2000s, Diddy rode that wave, not as a passenger, but as a captain. He later parlayed that success into other televised ventures, award shows, commercials, documentaries. He even launched Revolt, a music-oriented digital cable network. Because Diddy didn't just want to be on TV. He wanted to own the channel. Looking back, it's easy to joke about the cheesecake walk, the yelling, the catchphrases. But what Diddy understood, far ahead of most, was this. Television is a mirror, and whoever holds the mirror shapes the reflection. So while others rapped about building empires, he was filming it. Week by week, brick by brick. And in doing so, he gave the world a new version of himself. Not just the music mogul, not just the fashion icon, but the TV kingmaker. A man who could create stars, while still being the brightest one in the room. When we think of moguls, especially those born of hip-hop's golden age, we often picture a certain archetype, brash, untouchable, surrounded by bodyguards and decadence. But Diddy knew how to play with perception. You see, it wasn't enough for him to be rich, or famous, or feared. He wanted something more rare in the world of relentless self-branding. He wanted to be respected. And that respect, the kind that lasts longer than a hit single or a fashion season, doesn't just come from power. It comes from intimacy. From letting people see the man behind the mogul. That's where his role as a father came in. Let's step back for a moment. By the early 2000s, Diddy wasn't just a music executive or a cultural figure. He was a brand, and that brand began to shift towards something more palatable, more enduring. Yes, he still hosted opulent parties and wore diamonds like confetti. But in between the flashbulbs and headlines, were photos of him cradling a child. walking hand in hand with his daughters, celebrating milestones as a father with as much fervor as he once launched albums. He had 7 children, some biological, others adopted, and all woven into the tapestry of his public image. And from the outside, he wore fatherhood like a tailored suit, sharp, intentional, camera-ready. We saw the matching outfits on red carpets, the lavish birthday parties shared online, the quiet moments, in kitchens, at recitals, beside hospital beds, glimpsed through curated social media posts. But was it a performance? Or something deeper? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Because for Diddy, every role served the larger play, and the father figure was no exception. He often spoke of his late father, Melvin Combs, a man who was gunned down in Harlem when Sean was just 2 years old. That absence haunted him. It fueled him. In interviews, he described how he longed for a father growing up, a guide, a protector, a force. And in becoming a father himself, he vowed to never be the ghost that haunted his children's memories. He was present. Not just with money, but with time. Not just with gifts, but with words, encouragement, guidance, even discipline. He posted about family vacations, homework help, and bedtime stories. He called his daughters princesses and his sons young kings. He pushed them toward education, artistry, and self-confidence. To the public, it looked like balance. The empire on one hand, and the playground on the other. And in a genre often criticized for celebrating absentee fatherhood or glorifying chaos, Diddy offered a different archetype. The black father who showed up, who stayed, who led. But of course, image and reality are never quite the same. Behind closed doors, those relationships were not without tension. Former partners spoke of difficult dynamics. Court cases emerged over child support. There were whispers of control, emotional, financial, relational, that blurred the lines between love and dominance. Still, the public wanted to believe in the myth. Because it was comforting. Because it made Diddy more human, more accessible, more real. And perhaps that was his greatest sleight of hand. To remain larger than life, while making you feel like you knew him. When Kim Porter, the mother of 3 of his children, tragically passed away in 2018, something shifted. The photos changed. The captions softened. And for a brief moment, the mogul looked small. Grieving. Wounded. Holding his daughters close like lifelines. He posted tributes, wept publicly, spoke of regret and love and memory. And the world watching remembered. This was not just a man of champagne towers and yachts. This was a man who loved. Who lost. And that kind of vulnerability is the rarest currency of all. Still, even as the years passed and controversies bubbled at the edges, Diddy kept the family image close. He took his children to premieres. He let cameras into his home. He accepted awards while holding their hands. Because legacy, for him, was no longer just about music or fashion or Forbes lists. It was about lineage. About what your name meant after you were gone. And in that sense, Diddy presented himself as both builder and guardian. Not just of a business empire, but of a family dynasty. Yet, as we'll see in the chapters to come, that carefully crafted image would face tests. Because the greater the myth, the more shattering its fall. And in Diddy's case, the gap between the public father and the private man would soon come under fire. Not in whispers, but in headlines. We live in a culture obsessed with numbers, with rankings, with net worths, with that elusive billionaire status, the modern-day crown that signals not just wealth, but victory. And for years, Sean, Diddy, Combs seemed to walk steadily toward that throne. Whispers began in the mid-2000s, low and speculative at first. "He's close. He's already there. He's hip-hop's first billionaire." He was, by all appearances, everywhere. His fingerprints weren't just on music anymore. They were on vodka bottles and couture, on television and fragrances, on skyscrapers and private jets. Diddy had become not just a man, but a machine. A diversified, unstoppable force. And the world watched as Forbes, that oracle of modern fortune, began placing his name higher and higher on their annual lists of hip-hop's wealthiest figures. By 2011, he topped the chart. Then again in 2013, and 2015, and 2017. Always in competition with fellow moguls like Jay-Z and Dr. Dre, he remained a constant. The man who didn't just earn, he owned. But what exactly built the mountain beneath him? Let's take stock. His record label, Bad Boy Records, brought in tens of millions, launching platinum careers, licensing music, and striking lucrative distribution deals. His fashion empire, Sean John, redefined hip-hop couture. It wasn't just merch. It was a brand that walked runways and filled department stores. In 2008, he sold a majority stake in Sean John to Global Brands Group for a reported $100 million. Then there was Ciroc, the vodka partnership that turned into a masterclass in lifestyle branding. Diddy didn't just endorse the liquor, he embodied it. The suits, the yachts, the silver ice buckets and rooftop soirees. Ciroc became synonymous with wealth, luxury, and Diddy himself. According to reports, his arrangement wasn't a traditional endorsement deal. It was a 50-50 profit split. And by 2014, it was estimated that Ciroc alone had netted him more than $100 million. And still, that was only part of the puzzle. He had a stake in Revolt, a music television network he co-founded to give voice to hip-hop culture and black media. He launched AQUA Hydrate, a premium water brand, alongside Mark Wahlberg. He held real estate across the country, a $40 million mansion in Holmby Hills, luxury condos in New York, sprawling estates in Georgia and New Jersey. He traveled in private jets, wore custom-tailored suits, hosted Met Gala after-parties, and still found time to be the face of a fragrance line and multiple endorsement deals. At a certain point, it became hard to tell where Diddy ended and the empire began. And then came the big whisper, the one that circulated among blogs and boardrooms alike. He's a billionaire now. In 2019, Forbes estimated his net worth at $740 million, trailing just behind Jay-Z. And yet there were persistent claims, from associates, insiders, even Diddy himself, that the number was higher. Much higher. Because some of Diddy's deals weren't public. And some assets, especially intellectual property, equity stakes, and deferred payments, don't always appear on balance sheets. The truth? No one really knew. But that uncertainty only added to the mystique. Because Diddy wasn't just building wealth. He was building the myth of wealth, the image of a man who turned Harlem hustle into a billion-dollar blueprint. He played rich like an instrument. Custom Maybachs. All-white parties in the Hamptons. Champagne towers. Iconic watches. A presence so grand, so polished, so omnipresent, you didn't question the numbers. You believed the brand. And therein lies the magic of Diddy's financial rise. It was as much perception as it was profit. He understood that in entertainment, being believed to be a billionaire often mattered more than actually being one. And for most of the 2010s, the world believed. Even when he dropped off the Forbes billionaires list in more recent years, few doubted he could claw his way back. The empire was too sprawling, the man too strategic. But as the story began to darken, as accusations emerged, lawsuits surfaced, and the spotlight turned colder, something shifted. Suddenly, the mansions became less impressive, the jets less glamorous, the empire less impenetrable. Because no amount of money can protect you from the truth, or from perception turned against you. And Diddy, for all his branding genius, was beginning to learn that wealth is not always armor. Sometimes, it's a magnifying glass. And as the next chapters will show, the higher the number, the longer the fall. Every empire, no matter how tall the towers or glittering the facade, eventually reveals its fractures. Not all at once. Not in public. But through whispers. Uncomfortable silences. And shadows that don't quite behave in the light. For years, the world marveled at Diddy's ascent, the mogul who could not miss. Music. Fashion. Liquor. Media. Everything he touched seemed to gleam with gold. But behind the scenes, the foundations had begun to tremble. The whispers started quietly. An assistant let go without warning. A model who signed an NDA after a strange encounter. A producer who never showed up to court, but whose silence had clearly been purchased. Nothing stuck. Nothing made headlines. But if you were paying attention, if you listened closely, a pattern began to form. And that pattern looked a lot like control. There were the lawsuits, some public, many buried deep in court records. Disputes over royalties. Sudden severance packages. Allegations of intimidation and manipulation, filed by former employees, collaborators, and business partners, only to vanish from the news cycle within days. Settlements were paid. Agreements signed. Documents sealed. And with each one, the message was clear. This was a man with power. Not just in music, but in silence. One former associate, who asked not to be named, described working with Diddy as being close to the sun. It was warm. It was exciting. But get too close, ask the wrong question, challenge the wrong assumption, and suddenly you were frozen out. There were rumors of private investigators, of phone calls placed late at night, politely reminding people of their contractual obligations, of non-disclosure agreements so sweeping, so airtight, that even casual acquaintances grew wary of speaking on the record. It wasn't just business. It was fortress building. And for a while, it worked. Diddy's brand remained pristine. He smiled for cameras, posted family photos, spoke about black excellence, entrepreneurship, and generational wealth. He was charismatic, uplifting, infectious in his optimism. But behind that smile, there were cracks. One lawsuit from a former chef described harassment and a hostile work environment. Another from a producer hinted at verbal abuse and exploitative contracts. A third, barely covered in mainstream media, involved allegations of threats and coercion, later dropped after a private settlement was reached. Each case, standing alone, could be explained away. But together, they began to hum with a strange rhythm. A dissonance between the image and the experience. And then came the more disturbing murmurs. Not just of difficult business dealings, but of women. Claims, unverified, often silenced by settlements, of inappropriate behavior. Of relationships that began with champagne and ended in restraining orders. Of high-profile girlfriends who simply disappeared from public life, never to speak of their time with him again. Once again, nothing stuck. But the volume was increasing. Journalists began to circle, carefully, hesitantly. They knew Diddy's reach. They knew how quickly a career could be chilled by the wrong question. But some began to ask anyway. What really happened with that former assistant? Why did a promising artist suddenly quit the industry after working with Bad Boy? Why were so many lawsuits settled so quickly, and sealed so completely? The answers, when they came, were vague. Creative differences. Unsubstantiated claims. Resolved amicably. But beneath those boilerplate responses lay a truth that couldn't be denied. There were cracks in the empire. Cracks that money papered over. Cracks that charisma distracted from. Cracks that fans, for a long time, were willing to ignore. Until they couldn't. Because cracks, left unattended, don't just spread. They split. And by the late 2010s, the questions had grown louder than the music. Diddy still moved through the world like a king. But the whispers now followed him, into boardrooms, courtrooms, and the comment sections of every post he made. Some still defended him. Others began to wonder. What, exactly, had been hidden beneath the mansion gates and silk suits all this time? What had been paid for, not in cash, but in silence? And how long could it all hold together? Before something finally broke? Sometimes the most devastating earthquakes begin with a whisper. Not a tremor of the earth, but a shift in silence. In November of 2023, a silence that had lasted well over a decade shattered. And it came not from a tabloid, not from an anonymous leak, but from the voice of someone who had once stood beside Diddy on red carpets, in music videos, and in public affection. Cassie. Born Cassandra Ventura, a singer, model, and dancer with an ethereal beauty and a whisper-soft voice. To the world, she had always seemed mysterious, quiet, often in the background of Diddy's whirlwind lifestyle, but always there. For nearly a decade, she was his partner. In business. In public. In what many assumed was love. But what she revealed in late 2023 was something else entirely. The legal filing landed like a thunderclap. Submitted to federal court in New York on November 16, 2023. In its pages, Cassie described years of mistreatment during her time with Sean Diddy Combs. Not a single incident. Not a bitter breakup. But a consistent pattern, spanning more than a decade. It portrayed a relationship that began when she was 19 and Diddy was in his late 30s. A relationship marked, she said, by manipulation, control, and psychological harm. And the details were as disturbing as they were precise. Cassie claimed that Diddy subjected her to violent behavior. That he violated her boundaries after she tried to end the relationship. That he pressured her into highly uncomfortable situations, involving others, while he documented it, acts she says she never agreed to. She painted a picture of a man who used his wealth, power, and influence not to love her, but to dominate her, to isolate her, to control her. And for those who had followed Diddy's career closely, the timeline was jarring. The alleged mistreatment occurred during the same years he was appearing on daytime talk shows, walking red carpets with Cassie, and speaking publicly about family values and success. The legal complaint also referenced a web of non-disclosure agreements, surveillance, and intimidation. Cassie claimed she was followed by private investigators hired by Diddy, and that her phone and communications were monitored, all to ensure her silence, compliance, and fear. The public response was immediate and divided. Some were shocked, others less so. Because the hints had been there, hadn't they? In the way Cassie disappeared from the public eye after their split. In her quietness, her avoidance of interviews, her refusal to revisit the past. And in the context of the many other lawsuits and confidential settlements that had surrounded Diddy over the years, the ones that rarely made it past the headline, this felt different. Because this time she named him. Fully. Clearly. Directly. The case was extensive, painstakingly detailed, backed by documents, dates, and declarations. And then, less than 24 hours later, it was over. The world blinked. Diddy settled. Privately. Quietly. Quickly. No trial. No discovery. No public challenge. The terms of the settlement weren't disclosed, a standard resolution in cases involving high-profile figures. But the speed raised more questions than answers. Why so fast? Why no denial in court? And what, exactly, was being protected? Diddy released a brief statement. He denied the claims. He said the settlement was not an admission of wrongdoing, but a desire to move forward peacefully. To protect his family. To avoid a media circus. Cassie's legal team, however, stood firm. They called her brave. They said the lawsuit was about accountability, and that the speed of the settlement said more than words ever could. In the days that followed, media lit up. Podcasts, think pieces, and social commentary picked apart every detail. Some applauded Cassie for speaking her truth. Others asked, why now? Still others wondered how many more stories like hers had been buried. Under paperwork, silenced by money, lost in legal fog. And then, as suddenly as it began, the storm passed. No press conference. No courtroom drama. No conclusion. Just a heavy silence. And a world left to wonder, what comes next? But in that silence, something shifted. Because Cassie's story wasn't just about one woman and one man. It was about power. About celebrity. About the culture of secrecy that often surrounds the rich, the charming, and the seemingly untouchable. Her legal complaint opened the door, even just a crack. And behind that door, many believe, lie years of unspoken stories. Of closed settlements. Of patterns impossible to ignore. Diddy's empire still stands. The jets. The properties. The brand. But now, that empire carries something else. Doubt. And in that doubt, a reckoning has begun. When one voice breaks the silence, it often opens a door. And through that door, more begin to speak. After Cassie's public legal action sent ripples through the entertainment world, the dam began to crack. What had long been speculated behind closed doors, carefully managed and legally shielded, started to spill into the light. In the following weeks and months, several women came forward. Not with whispers, but with firm, unsettling testimonies. Each one added a new thread to a narrative that now seemed far more troubling than most had imagined. There were accounts of intense control, psychological strain, and environments where stepping away felt nearly impossible. Some described being drawn into Diddy's inner circle with promises of opportunity, only to find themselves in situations where expectations blurred and personal space diminished. One individual spoke of ongoing emotional manipulation, of feeling overlooked and devalued. Another described private gatherings where alcohol and substances created pressure, and how silence became the unspoken rule afterward. The official filings were serious. Some mentioned surveillance and monitoring. Others discussed contractual obligations that were signed under stress, raising concerns about consent and autonomy. What caught the attention of legal analysts and observers was how consistent many of the stories were. Different women, different years, but patterns that echoed. It began to form a larger picture, one not just of individual claims, but of a culture that many were now questioning. Attorneys noted how rare it was to see so many claims surface in such a short span. A sign that the silence surrounding this part of the industry might finally be breaking. The allegations didn't stop at personal behavior. Some cases referenced questionable business practices, using influence to protect reputations or manage crises behind the scenes. There were also questions raised about the environment within some of Diddy's companies, and whether concerns had been dismissed too easily for too long. As the number of cases grew, so did public awareness. Diddy and his legal team now faced scrutiny on a scale that made discretion harder to maintain. For years, he had been seen as a symbol of success, a man who turned vision into victory, building an empire from nothing. But now, that image faced unprecedented challenge. His responses remained calm and deliberate. He denied the allegations. His team described the claims as exaggerated or entirely unfounded. They argued that his accomplishments were being unfairly overshadowed by opportunistic attacks. Still, many found the growing number of voices difficult to dismiss. Journalists started digging deeper. Former associates spoke out. Court records resurfaced. And slowly, a broader narrative began to form. Social platforms gave momentum to these developments, with users amplifying the voices of those coming forward and demanding transparency. The cultural moment that had shifted years earlier was now knocking at the gates of one of music's most powerful legacies. While legal outcomes remained to be seen, the immediate impact was undeniable. Brands distanced themselves. Partnerships were paused. And the myth of invincibility began to dissolve. Somewhere, in the quieter corners of public discourse, a question lingers. How many more stories are still untold? Because the voices we've heard may only be the beginning, and the foundation of an empire, no matter how grand, can only endure so many cracks. It was a moment that stunned not only fans and critics, but the very industry that had long revered him. In early 2024, headlines emerged that law enforcement had conducted coordinated visits to several of Sean Combs' properties, prompting widespread speculation and an immediate media storm. The contrast could not have been more striking. Where once there were red carpets and rooftop celebrations, now there were quiet arrivals in unmarked vehicles, officials in suits, their presence deliberate and precise. Picture it. A tranquil morning interrupted by a knock at the door. Not the press. Not an entourage. But individuals carrying official credentials and quiet intentions. The residences in question, lavish, familiar to magazine spreads and social media, now became the focus of a developing situation. Authorities, according to reports, were acting under official orders as part of an inquiry linked to ongoing civil litigation and business practices across multiple ventures. What prompted this escalation? What were they hoping to uncover behind the scenes of a man who had, for decades, defined the very idea of hip-hop luxury and success? At the heart of these proceedings was a growing interest in the operational structure of Diddy's vast financial empire. An empire that spans fashion, music, spirits, media, and global real estate. This wasn't just about the surface, the glamour, the hits, the headlines. It was about the machinery underneath. Multiple insiders suggested that the visits were part of a broader review of financial transactions, contractual relationships, and digital records tied to business entities and public allegations that had surfaced in the months prior. Reports noted that computers, phones, and documentation were collected for review, not necessarily for immediate charges, but as part of what analysts called a complex and evolving review process. No formal conclusions had been reached. No indictments announced. But the scale of it all signaled a turning point. For decades, Sean Combs had represented the American dream. A man from Harlem who transformed hustle into high fashion. Who went from dancing in the background to owning the stage, the boardroom, and the skyline. Now, the very reach of that dream was under question. Legal commentators observed that the investigation might be examining not only public controversies, but also potential irregularities in how finances had been managed or protected during times of legal exposure. No one, not even the most seasoned experts, could say exactly where the lines were being drawn. Speculative concerns were also voiced about whether influence had been used to protect reputations, or whether agreements had been crafted to avoid public scrutiny. But again, nothing was proven. All of it remained in the space between fact and inquiry, where legal thresholds must still be met and assumptions must give way to evidence. In the days following, Diddy's legal team issued brief statements. They emphasized cooperation. They rejected the more dramatic portrayals in the press. And they reaffirmed his commitment to his businesses, his family, and his legacy. But in the court of public opinion, something had changed. For the first time in his long and carefully curated career, Diddy found himself not just surrounded by flashbulbs, but scrutinized by the quiet, deliberate process of legal review. Inside the industry, sources described a mood shift. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Brands began revisiting contracts. And the man once seen as untouchable now felt vulnerable. This wasn't just another controversy. This was the slow, silent pressure of scrutiny. And as the process unfolds, cautiously, methodically, it raises a question that no amount of platinum records or champagne-soaked parties can silence. What truly lies beneath the empire? And can a legacy this large survive the weight of a world that's finally willing to look closer? In the wake of the 2024 legal scrutiny, the world waited. Fans, journalists, and entertainment insiders held their breath, watching and wondering what would come next from Sean Combs, the man the world knew simply as Diddy. Would he speak? Would he respond publicly, as he had so many times before, with confidence, charisma, and full command of the narrative? What came instead was something altogether unexpected. Silence. Not just a pause, but a deliberate stillness. One that echoed more powerfully than any press conference or polished statement could. In an age where public figures often move quickly to address headlines, through interviews, videos, or sweeping posts on social media, Diddy's reaction was notably subdued. There were no camera-ready rebuttals, no lengthy captions or live appearances. His voice, once ever present in the media, seemed to fade. Not out of irrelevance, but out of intention. For days, then weeks, and eventually months, he remained mostly quiet. A silence that many interpreted as either a strategic retreat or a deeply personal response to an unfolding situation. And the public noticed. Because this was the same figure who had once lived fully in the spotlight. Whose every move was covered, celebrated, and shared. Now, his absence was its own kind of headline. Some suggested the silence was guided by legal counsel. A careful, composed decision meant to avoid inflaming a delicate situation. Others saw it as a man taking time. Perhaps to reflect, to shield his family, or to manage things privately in a world that had suddenly shifted. Whatever the motivation, the change in tone was striking. Gone were the familiar scenes of red carpets and champagne toasts. In their place, quiet statements from representatives, brief and formal in nature. Phrases like, fully cooperating, denying all claims, and committed to moving forward, became the public voice of a man no longer speaking for himself. His digital platforms, once vibrant with glimpses of luxury and celebration, softened. Some posts were archived. Others leaned toward family, faith, or quiet reflection. For those who followed his career, it was a remarkable transformation. From the mogul who once celebrated success in front of the world, to someone now navigating complexity away from the public eye. And with that withdrawal came questions. What was next for the brand, the businesses, the legacy? Would there be a return to the spotlight? And if so, what would it look like? Of course, silence doesn't always signal weakness. Sometimes, it's a form of strength. A pause in which to regroup, to plan, to protect. Behind the scenes, sources suggested Diddy was carefully rebuilding. Not just legally, but reputationally. His teams, from attorneys to advisors, were said to be focused on strategy, managing narratives, and evaluating long-term steps. But in the absence of a clear voice from Diddy himself, the public filled in the blanks. Stories, theories, and projections swirled. A reminder that in fame, as in life, absence creates its own kind of presence. One thing became certain. The man who once seemed to define the sound and style of a generation had now become something else entirely. A figure wrapped in quiet. And in that quiet, the world waited, still unsure whether it was witnessing a pause or the closing of a chapter. When a towering figure like Diddy faces a storm of controversy, the ripple effects aren't confined to headlines or courtrooms. They sweep through boardrooms, strategy calls, and corporate meetings, reshaping the very architecture of a legacy built over decades. In the wake of ongoing public scrutiny, a new reality began to settle in. The companies, sponsors, and collaborators who had once proudly stood beside Diddy were now reconsidering. The shift began quietly. Private conversations among executives took on a different tone, marked not by excitement, but hesitation. Then came the moves. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Brands once deeply intertwined with Diddy's image began to quietly back away. Long-standing partnerships, from premium beverages to fashion ventures to media platforms, now faced growing questions. What had once been a badge of cultural relevance became, for some, a perceived liability. And in today's climate, perception shapes reality. Sponsorships ended without fanfare. Marketing campaigns were quietly paused or rebranded. Scheduled appearances, collaborations, and events were removed from calendars with little public explanation. The empire, once synonymous with influence and momentum, began to feel the pressure. Not all at once, but in a slow, undeniable unraveling. Valuations dipped. Investor confidence cooled. And behind the scenes, teams worked to assess risk and distance. For employees and creative collaborators, the mood shifted. Some projects were placed on indefinite hold. Others reshaped or shelved. This wasn't simply about damage control. It was a reflection of a broader shift in how public figures are held accountable. The era of brand immunity was giving way to something different: public responsibility, consumer voice, and values-driven decisions. Diddy's lack of public response only deepened the uncertainty. In the absence of his voice, speculation filled the void. And in a landscape shaped by perception as much as proof, silence can speak volumes. For years, Diddy represented the pinnacle of self-made success. A mogul who rose from the streets of Harlem to global acclaim. But even the brightest stars can face shadows. The speed of this brand unraveling was astonishing. What once took decades to build seemed to shift in mere months. Each new headline chipped away at an image that had once felt invincible. And yet, as history has shown us time and time again, public figures are not static. Some fall and rise again. Others reinvent. Some disappear entirely. What remains to be seen is how this chapter ends. Whether the empire finds stability, or whether this moment marks the beginning of an irreversible turning point. For now, the questions persist. Not just about contracts or companies, but about legacy, leadership, and what happens when power meets accountability in the public eye. There was a time when the name, Diddy, echoed with undeniable reverence across music studios, boardrooms, and popular culture. A symbol of ambition, innovation, and influence, he became the embodiment of the modern American dream, a self-made figure who rose from the streets of Harlem to the global stage. But legacy is not fixed. It breathes. It bends. It shifts, shaped by time, by perception, and by the unfolding of events both celebrated and questioned. And in recent years, that legacy has entered a more complicated chapter. Where once there was widespread admiration, today there is scrutiny. Where there was celebration, now there is reflection. The man long regarded as a cultural trailblazer, a visionary of hip-hop's golden age, a business innovator, a style icon, is now at the center of a conversation far larger than music or fame. This transformation is about more than one man. It reflects a cultural moment, where society begins to examine power, influence, and responsibility with sharper eyes and deeper expectations. For decades, Diddy's impact was undeniable. He redefined the music industry, launching artists, reshaping marketing, and opening doors that had long been closed. He expanded into fashion, media, and branding, leaving a mark on nearly every facet of entertainment. He wasn't just following trends, he was creating them. But now, as public perception evolves, new questions emerge. What remains of that legacy when it's viewed through a different lens? Can we separate the art from the artist, the empire from its architect? For many, his creative work still resonates. The albums, the collaborations, the anthems of a generation, they endure. For others, this period of reflection brings forward discomfort, questions, and caution. Conversations now focus on the realities of fame, on the influence that comes with power, and the importance of personal integrity. Some argue that legacy must be reevaluated in light of a broader understanding of leadership and responsibility. Others continue to celebrate the milestones, even as they acknowledge the complexities. In this time of cultural awareness, the public narrative has changed. Success is no longer a shield. Influence alone is not the whole story. We are now in an era where values, transparency, and accountability matter more than ever. Diddy's current chapter is not the closing of a book, but the turning of a page. For some, this is a story still unfolding, a journey with potential for reckoning, for learning, even for redemption. For others, it is a cautionary reminder that empires must be built not just on brilliance, but on solid ground. And so, his legacy, like those of many icons, remains complex, marked by extraordinary cultural achievement and new, difficult conversations. As this story continues to unfold, it challenges all of us to think deeply about how we remember greatness and how we define it. Because legacy is not only about what we build in the spotlight. It is also about what remains when the light begins to fade. And in that quiet space, we begin to understand the full weight of a life lived so publicly. With all its triumphs, contradictions, and truths. In the world of glitz and glamour, where power and money weave an intricate dance, the truth is often the first casualty. When the spotlight dims and the headlines fade, rumors begin to ripple beneath the surface. Whispers that refuse to be silenced, fragments of stories half told, secrets carefully shielded behind layers of influence. And with Diddy's fall from grace, those whispers have only grown louder. What truly happened behind the closed doors of his sprawling empire? How many stories remain untold, buried beneath the weight of non-disclosure agreements, quiet settlements, and a culture that protects its own? There are murmurs, vague but persistent, of industry cover-ups that shield the powerful from scrutiny, of legal maneuvers designed not to seek justice, but to contain scandal. Sources close to the situation hint at a system so deeply intertwined with wealth and influence that unraveling it seems nearly impossible. Some claim that the sudden severing of business ties and the swift settlements with accusers are less about guilt or innocence, and more about damage control, a calculated effort to protect the empire's fragile foundation. In hushed tones, there are stories of whispered threats, careful silences, and a network of enablers who keep troubling truths out of the public eye. Journalists, insiders, and even some former associates have alluded to a web of complicity, suggesting that what we see on the surface is only a fraction of a far more complex reality. How deep does this silence run? Is it a temporary pause before the full story breaks free? Or a permanent shadow that will forever obscure the truth? These questions linger, heavy and unresolved. And yet, with every new allegation, every startling headline, the public's thirst for answers intensifies. Social media becomes a courtroom where theories multiply, some grounded in facts, others fueled by speculation and rumor. This fog of uncertainty makes it difficult to separate truth from fiction, justice from manipulation. What is clear is that the silence itself is telling. In a world that thrives on transparency and exposure, the layers of secrecy surrounding this saga only deepen suspicion. There are also whispers about powerful figures within the entertainment industry who may have a stake in keeping the story contained, whose names never surface publicly, but whose influence shapes the course of investigations and media narratives. Some say these shadows exist to protect the image of a culture that has long celebrated excess and turned a blind eye to misconduct. And then there are the unresolved questions about those who may have suffered in silence. The voices not yet heard, the stories never shared. What price is paid when truth is sacrificed on the altar of fame and fortune? As we sift through the facts, the statements, and the silence, one thing becomes clear. The full story remains tantalizingly out of reach. The official records tell one part. The court filings and settlements hint at another. But beyond that lies a vast terrain of conjecture and concealed realities. For now, all we can do is listen closely to the whispers, question the gaps, and hold space for the possibility that the truth, in all its complexity, is still waiting to emerge. Because sometimes, what we don't know is as telling as what we do. And in that space of uncertainty, the legacy of Diddy's empire hangs precariously, waiting for the silence to finally be broken. There is something almost Shakespearean about the arc of Diddy's journey, a story of meteoric rise, glittering rain, and a precipitous fall that seems to unfold in real time before the world's watchful eyes. From the gritty streets of Harlem to the glistening penthouses and sprawling mansions of the elite, Sean Combs built an empire that many could only dream of, a cultural titan who transformed the very fabric of music, fashion, and business. He was not just a rapper, producer, or entrepreneur, he was a symbol. A symbol of success, of hustle, of the American dream actualized. But symbols are fragile things. And when the foundation beneath them begins to crack, the fall can be devastating. The story of Diddy's unraveling is a stark reminder of how swiftly fortune can shift, how the empire that once seemed invincible can start to crumble beneath the weight of scandal, legal battles, and lost trust. It is a tale not only of wealth and power but of vulnerability and the consequences of unchecked ambition. One cannot help but wonder, is this the end of the road for Diddy? Can someone who once seemed untouchable now rebuild from the ashes? Redemption in the public eye is a complex, elusive beast. It demands not just contrition, but transparency, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and change. For a figure so deeply entwined in the very industries that are now scrutinizing him, the path forward is uncertain. Will the public ever fully forgive? Will the business world re-embrace him? Or is this the final curtain on a once dazzling career? Yet, human stories rarely end in absolute terms. There is always room for nuance, for second chances, for reinvention. History is replete with cautionary tales that evolve into stories of resilience and comeback. But that journey requires more than just time, it demands accountability and transformation. As we reflect on Diddy's rise, from a young man with a vision in Harlem to a mogul with a global footprint, it is impossible to ignore the stark contrast with the present moment. From boardrooms and red carpets to courtrooms and headlines, his empire has been shaken to its core. Whether that dust settles into a fertile ground for rebirth or the remnants fade into oblivion is a question that remains unanswered. What remains undeniable is the cultural impact Diddy has left behind, the music he helped create, the artists he launched, and the business models he pioneered. That legacy, however complicated, is etched into the fabric of modern entertainment. And so, as we close this chapter, we are left with a meditation on impermanence, on how even the mightiest empires, built on dreams and millions, can falter. And perhaps, a silent hope that within the ruins, there might still be the seeds of redemption. Because in the end, every story, no matter how grand or tragic, is still being written. And only time will tell what comes next. We reach the end of this chapter, a story of dazzling heights and sudden shadows, of a man who shaped an era and now faces the echoes of his choices. Diddy's empire is a mirror reflecting both the allure and the fragility of fame and power. As you lay back and let these words settle, remember that behind every headline and every empire are human stories, complex, messy, and ever unfolding. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ambition, triumph, and trial. Wherever you are in the world, may this quiet hour bring you reflection, peace, and curiosity for the stories still to come. Good night.